Whether you're running 2 trials or 200, real-time CTMS can make your research site operations more efficient. Real-time systems allow users to manage complex clinical research processes with powerful, user-friendly interfaces that are revolutionizing how research gets done. To get a free demo, visit the company's website at realtime-ctms.com and fill out one of their contact forms. Hello and welcome to the Note to File podcast, a collection of interviews, best practices, and candid commentary for clinical research sites. I'm your host, Brad Hightower. Today we're deviating from the standard podcast format and delving a little more deeply into one topic, decentralized clinical trials. I feel we see a great deal of conversation around DCTs from sponsors, CROs, and vendors, but not so much from sites themselves. So this is our humble attempt to bring the site voice a little more to the forefront in an increasingly overcrowded space. Our site voices today are Joy Jurnack and Dr. Viviënne van de Walle. Joy has a long and diverse career in clinical trials and includes roles everywhere from clinical research nurse to research subject advocate, IRB member, and ACRP fellow. Joy's recent passion is now how decentralization at the clinical research enterprise can include both innovation and products available to expand, develop, and implement this progress to include considering DCT as an extension of clinical research sites. Our other guest is Dr. van der Walle. She is a physician by training who studied medicine both at the University of Maastricht and at the University of Oxford. She's always continued to combine clinical research with patient care and has been a full-time PI at independent clinical research sites. She also co-founded and owns and operates an independent research site, PTNR, in the Netherlands. In this episode, we discuss decentralized clinical trials, their influence on PI oversight, site budgets, vendors and portals, and so much more. Up first, Joy Jurnack. All right, Joy, thanks so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me, Brad. I'm really glad to be here.
Cool. So this is a sort of topic du jour is decentralized trials. To sort of set the stage, as we had talked about sort of off tape, there's so much conversation about decentralized trials. I feel like it's very much driven from the vendor and sponsor side. So it's really my hope to sort of get more of a site level take on what this decentralization really means for sites. Do you have, I guess, first and foremost, sort of an issue that I know is of interest to you is how does PI oversight change with more decentralized methods, or do you feel like there's any risk for PIs as things sort of get further away from the site, so to speak? What's your take on that?
Oh, gosh. So I just want to start out by saying, in my opinion, decentralization is all about not only the subject who's enrolled in the study, but also the site. The principal investigator continues in research according to the rules, according to the regulations, according to the ethics. The principal investigator oversees research. And whether it is a brick and mortar or it is a hybrid or it is completely decentralized, those rules and regulations remain the same. And I think it's really important to remember that too. And there may be a little bit of maybe bifurcation between a principal investigator in an academic institution and a principal investigator in a standalone research site. I'm not sure we'll dig into all that today, but I think there are nuances between the two of them that may want to be discussed further down the line. Nevertheless, it is the site that runs the trial under the direction of the PI. So our rules don't change. Our tenets don't change. And I think it's important for us to dig down and really think about that as we move forward with the discussion of decentralization. I think pretty strongly that if you leave the sites behind, if you burden the sites, if you add on too many bells and whistles, that the sites are going to be inundated and research participant, research recruitment is going to suffer. Now, if we look back and think about what decentralization has been defined as, we can look at FDA, we can look at CTTI. There's a couple of definitions out there. A lot of them have to do with discussion of electronic or data capturing models, data capturing devices that a subject would wear outside of the institution. And I think that's interesting. And I think we need to consider data and safety and integrity. And you can't take away the human side of research, even in decentralization. So what does that mean? That means that the principal investigator and the research team have to be able to develop relationships with vendors, sponsors, ancillary health agencies within their community, and put together something that is a cohesive research enterprise. In addition, the PI must ensure that the folks that participate in the research, the folks that go out and conduct the study visits, monitor the subject during the protocol, are in fact trained on research. Brad, we had a little discussion beforehand about the difference between clinical practice and clinical research. You don't need to go any further than the great 10-page document written in 1979, the Belmont Report, to clearly see that there is a bifurcation between what clinical practice means, how the doctor interacts with the patient, and what the relationship between the researcher and the subject is. And we could talk a whole hour about that, but suffice to say, research is a question. We're trying to find an answer, and that's the relationship that investigator should have with that participant. So that being said, we know that it's research. We know that people have to be trained in research. But I think the training part is something that we're in a lot of the DCT models or potential protocols that I've already seen. Some of that training might not be as front and center as it should be. I'll back up to just, we're talking about the PI, the relationship between research should almost be, I always looked at it as like a triangle. It's really the PI, or where the research being taken place, and it's the sponsor, and it's the IRB, protecting human subjects. So that triangle is really important, when we're talking about research. And those rules cannot change between brick and mortar, hybrid, or completely decentralized, if you mean. And for these purposes, decentralization means study visits taking place outside the brick and mortar. So that's my start.
Well, and that's what I sure. And I think what sort of interests me is that, in my experience, I think you sort of alluded to, there's a lot of what we do is driven by relationships. And, I think very importantly is that a PI trusts his study team to delegate tasks to them so that they can carry out research in a way that the PI feels confident that the rights and safety of the subjects are being protected. And as more vendors sort of throw their hats in the ring to decentralize some of the research processes, does this sort of take or create a layer between the PI and the research subject so that there's less oversight? For example, if they're sending a mobile nursing vendor out to see these patients, ostensibly the physician has no relationship with this mobile nurse. He may not know who they are, whether or not they're appropriately trained. You look at, recruitment is obviously sort of a big selling point of the DCT model. We can reach more patients. Well, especially, again, as more and more vendors get involved, how can the PI continue to ensure that these things are being done appropriately? Do you think that is a cause for concern, or does it possibly maybe change the paradigm a little bit about PI oversight? Or I guess what effect do you feel that may have, if any?
We live in a capitalistic society. And as we spoke before, I cannot believe the amount of vendors that have popped up around the DCT model, and how, VC is just throwing money at trying to support these new ventures. The problem is the folks that are doing the development don't have any idea how to conduct a research trial. A lot of these companies, I feel, would do a lot better if they brought a research coordinator or a research nurse on board to help them understand that autonomy, justice, and beneficence is something you have to think of in research. Okay, so putting that all aside, And I think the FDA is going to weigh in soon, although I have no, firsthand knowledge of this. But we have to continue to operate on the same tenets of research as we always have. And if, in fact, you are running a clinical trial, which you, as a principal investigator and understanding your responsibilities as outlined in the federal regulations and guidance and ICH-GCP, and you are not you do not have proper oversight of your subjects, in fact, that's where problems are going to arise. So I think, and I kind of feel strongly about this, that vendors need to work more closely with research sites, that in essence, DCT is about site centricity. It's about bringing the site in. It's about not overburdening the site. It's about giving them tools and resources so that they can do the research ethically, collect data, make submissions so that drugs and devices, are approved. And I think that, really burrowing in, that relationship has to flourish. Now, the question is how, and it's not so much quell, these smart data people, but how do we collaborate more fully? Couple of ideas, my nephew's a coder, and I've been trying to work with him on some a very basic way of collecting source data outside the institution, a brick and mortar site, to enable quick transmission of that data back to the PI or the sub-I so that they can see what's going on with the subject. Now, I have been involved in a couple of preliminary discussions at a previous position where there was discussion that the source data was going to be FedEx to the site, and it would be 24 to 48 hours. Immediately, that set off red flags. If I'm seeing a subject and collecting data, if there's a problem, that has to be transmitted. Even if there's not a problem, that data needs to be immediately reviewed by an investigator at the site to make sure there's no adverse events. What's the bottom line? Protection of human subjects is what we're doing. So to me, building some sort of a free platform, and nobody's going to like this, but a relatively free basic platform that could be built onto so that decentralization, bringing subject-centric research to their homes or their business, can be done without an economic burden. Okay, so that's a roundabout way of talking on sort of answering your question on vendors. I think the vendors are, a lot of them are really, you know what? I'm going to take that back. I'm going to say that clinical research professionals need to come together and decide how we as professionals, how we want decentralization to happen. I'm really happy to be, I'm a longtime member of ACRP. I'm a fellow. I've been in this business for nearly as long as my children are alive. And we can't, as a profession, we can't allow sponsors, vendors to dictate to us how DCT should be conducted. We have to have a seat at the table. And a working group at ACRP right now, a group of the fellows are working on a position paper for, to come out of ACRP, a position paper supported by the fellows. It's a long process because there are 42 fellows right now, and there are a lot of people with a lot of different experiences. And we're trying to put together something that can transcend academic or, standalone sites, all sites that we can look at what does decentralization mean for the clinical research professional. So I think vendors should work with the site a little bit more. Let me give you an example, Brad. I'm working on a protocol. I've developed some source documentation. We're going to see folks both in the office, and and the protocol's been written that we're going to be able to decentralize some of this stuff. And in my mind, decentralization means not only capturing electronic data, but also capturing data outside the brick and mortar site, right? It's not just about the electronics. It's about the collecting of data outside the brick and mortar site. So how are we going to do that? So I'm putting together source document, and then we've got company Xenon coming in to say, oh, okay, we're going to be the vendor for this, and this is the information you should check. Well, why can't you upload my source document already is into whatever platform you have? Because this, from a research professional's mindset, this is how you should be collecting the data and work off what my source are. And allow the source to be reviewed each time. So if you have an electronic source, I've got a pad, a notebook that I'm adding things in at the subject's site. How am I going to make sure that that information goes from one visit to the next? How am I going to make sure that that adverse event is collected from one visit and is closed out at the next? If you, Mr. Vendor, Ms. Vendor, they vendor, have any sort of, if it's too labor intensive for me to collect all this stuff, because you are more of a data person than a clinical person or a research person, it might lose a lot in the translation, which it cannot. It cannot lose anything in the translation. We have to be able to collect the data, follow the data throughout the trial to make sure that we're collecting proper data points, that we're collecting adverse events, serious adverse events, of course, changes in concomitant medications, and those sort of things. So I think the flow of that information would be better achieved, would be better recorded if there was more of a collaborative relationship between a lot of vendors and the research teams. I think that would be a real benefit to our profession.
Yeah, and I think you touch on, a lot of good points there. One is that, I think even as a site, it's really overwhelming to see the amount of vendors and venture capital getting thrown around to these vendors. And, if you're paying attention, you start to wonder, well, what does this mean? What does this mean for us as a site? I do think, slowly but surely, we are seeing some of these DCT vendors and companies reach out and start to sort of collaborate with sites, because I think they are beginning to understand the value that you point out, because you can have a bunch of great solutions, but if it's not practical or overburdens the site, and we know but sites are already overburdened. It's insane how much sites are sort of on the hook for, when it comes to running these trials. So anything more is going to be met with, let's just say less than enthusiasm. And we see it now, a conversation I've had. If I have a study that's easy to run, and the subjects can easily participate versus one that's very difficult and requires a lot of heavy lifting from the site, well, guess which one's going to get more attention from the site? It's going to be the one that's easier for the site to work, frankly. But again, I do see a little bit more sort of reaching across the aisle, so to speak, from these DCT companies. So I'm sort of encouraged by that. And I think sort of something else you alluded to is it's still not clear what's going to be sort of imposed by the sponsors and vendors versus what the sites can have some control over, which is another kind of area of interest. Because again, I think we already are research is very top down. The sponsor says, here's your tools, you're using these, and we're not paying you to use your own solution or to sort of have your own choice. So here's what you're going to use. So I'm curious to see if this movement changes that in any way, for better or worse. Frankly, it could go either way. Either we're going to just have 10 more systems to log into, or maybe we do start to see some true, collaborative initiatives with sites, so that maybe there is some choice in the matter, which I find exciting. I think unlikely, but very exciting. So yeah, those are all sort of almost deep topics in and of themselves that I think just breed more questions.
Oh, sure. And, when we thought of that triangle that I talked about earlier, the sponsors need to come up with protocols that are proactive, not retroactive, to allow the sites to integrate decentralization, maybe by the way clinical research professionals define it, but allow decentralization up front, not in amendments, not in protocol rewrites, but there has to be more of a partnership. Frankly, it's even the amount of CRO input sometimes is discouraging to sites. It's like they protect the sponsor too much. And I think a discussion for a while needs to involve the sponsors so that they can really get the fact that we want to do this stuff. We want to do it not just because we have all this electronic data capture we could do. We want to do it because it's supposed to be better for the subject. We're supposed to decentralize, is supposed to be subject centric. And unless we're presented with protocols that offer these options, we're not going to be able to flow through them.
Yeah, I mean, and that's no. I'm interested to see how IRBs deal with more and more decentralization. I started out my career in academia at a university. I'll be honest, I'm very glad I don't have to deal with a local IRB anymore. It was very difficult, very difficult. Yeah. So, central IRBs obviously make things much easier, but at the local level, I mean, I'm curious to see how these things sort of get parsed, because I think it's a lot more oversight and a lot more attention to detail when it comes to these methods. And look, for better or worse, the field we work in is not always the most progressive thinking. So something new is going to really raise a lot of alarm bells, I feel. So I'm curious to see if or how the role of academia continues with more DCT, and if that even, it already can take a long time to get a local IRB's approval. Are we going to be looking at extending that process even further? And if so, does that change the sort of attraction of a large academic site?
Well, that's just it. I don't know that larger academic sites or academic research sites are going to be able to do this, because right now the playing field isn't level, because you need so much funding in order to implement these decentralized vendors. And, what if in a town, in a city, that someone decides to go approach the home health agencies about the potential for learning about research, and part of their staff then becomes trained on research. And then when those home health, whether they're nurses or aides, I believe probably we're going to see an influx in nurses with decentralization coming along because of the ability to assess adverse events. But what about if that nurse, who hasn't been introduced at the site per se, or is, the PI talks to the patient telephonically and not telephonically, via Zoom or telemedicine. And then how about the research coordinator chimes in on a Zoom call or Google or whatever while the home health people are there? So that brings a team approach to this. So yeah, hey, Brad. Yeah, thanks for, we're here for, visit 2. We're going to draw some bloods. And we're going to ask some questions. And you see Laura's there. She's the home health nurse. And she's been trained in research. So we're going to go over what what's been going on with you. Remember last time you had a headache that went on for 4 days and you took a couple of Tylenol. Is that all better now? Oh yeah, that's better. I had a dizzy spell. Oh, when did that dizzy spell? Laura, could you check an orthostatic blood pressure for me to make sure that, so a collaborative approach to how we see a subject, because the team has now gained one. We haven't really lost one. We've gained one. So discussion of more teamwork and collaboration, but also a discussion of financial reimbursement. I don't see it being a them or us. I see it being a we, that yes, the cost of the visit may have to be split between 2 people. But then again, I'm at my desk, and while Laura is walking around to all the sites, I get to do my data entry, and then I pop back on the next time she sees a subject for that visit. These are some, I think people might think these are far out ideas, but to me, that's what this is all supposed to be. It's all supposed to be bringing research to the subject, not having the subject come. Now, Mrs. Jones may need to have an MRI. Of course, they come to the hospital for that. Mrs. Jones may be in a phase 1 study. Phase 1 studies are never going to be decentralized. They're always going to be brick and mortar. But for the studies that we can take to the subjects, we should. And then there's more, there's more issues. There's going into impoverished areas. There's lack of Wi-Fi. There could be safety concerns. Those are the things we should be dealing with. We should be thinking about rather than how many vendors are going to have, an e-consent form. First of all, the government should make, or I guess the FDA had, they're pulling it back now. The FDA put together, everybody should have one platform for e-consent. Now, that's not a very capitalistic way of looking at things, but it certainly simplifies the ability to do research across. Hey, sponsors, if you're hiring these vendors, you better have some oversight on them. You better know, in fact, that what they're doing is proper. The site cannot take on a burden of overseeing all the vendors. There has to be some kind of a partnership there. And if and when there comes scrutiny or data security or, lack of collecting something, you can't hammer the site and the PI for this the whole time, right? Whether that, even if that triangle turns to a square and, the PI, the sponsor, the IRB and vendors take equal responsibility for bringing good clinical research to the subjects and their family. There has to be a partnership. It can't just be, if you're going to reap the financial rewards, you're going to have to take on some of the responsibilities. To me, from a site perspective, to bringing research to a subject perspective or site centricity and subject centricity, there has to be so much more collaboration. And we cannot continue to work in silos as we always have. I think people are going to look at me funny. I am speaking in March at a conference where, my topic is how about integrating home health agencies into the research process? Why do we need to have a new company to hire nurses when we already have a company that has these services available? Why don't we ask them? Maybe that would be more business for them. Is that any harm to us? I don't think so. I think that just looks at research as collaborating with other already established healthcare facilities and bringing them into the research world. Maybe that's going to promote more diversity, maybe more understanding of what research means. Like all this stuff, I think would be good.
Yeah, and I think that provides that specific example I'm really interested in. I have a relationship with a home health company. Something I'd love to be able to do from a site level and to offer. I think there's a lot of advantage from that, especially that technique sort of being driven by the site. You can engage the community more. There's just a lot of benefit, financial as well. I'm not gonna hide that. I mean, that's certainly a benefit for the site. But as it stands, I don't have a single study that would allow that. Now, they may have their own mobile nursing or home health company they're working with, but why can't the site bring that to the table? And I think that's just a small example again of like, how can we sort of sort these things out so that, sites, something else you alluded to, sites don't want to lose revenue. They do want to make it easy for the patient, but if that's going to cut the revenue in half, then they're probably going to try to bring the patient in as much as humanly possible.
Well, until we iron this stuff out, Brad, you're absolutely correct, because they're not going to know what to do, and they're not going to be sure that subject is being protected. So yes, they're going to want to either second bring them in or whatever. But think about that. Think about you as a site. I already have a relationship with Acme Nursing Home Health Agency. And we know that Acme's got 25 nurses, and 13 of them have taken GCP, have expressed a concern, an interest in research, and, are willing to, be associated with some of these projects. So right away, you already have a teammate in this. So then you bring in, and however the bureaucracy will go over there, whatever the financial is, but it's almost like your vendor is your home health folks. And so right away, PI knows them. The PI knows they're trained. The PI knows that they understand. We already know we're using Google. We already have this infrastructure sort of set up. And maybe it's about, and there has to be other layers too, like who's going to transport them, bloods, this sort of thing. But this is the stuff we should be thinking about, not how many different platforms for e-consent there are. How are we going to mobilize these units in our city to go out to meet the needs of our, the patient population, which is involved in the research for whatever that disease condition is, right? Like we can study hypertension in white men all day long. Black men have a different response to hypertension, different response to medication. That's just the way it is. And, compared to white women, compared to Black women, right? So if we've got to make sure we use our ethical principles of justice and we, work with a community that is not always fully represented in our research, then we'll be able to offer this diversity more. But just saying diversity, we've got to open it up. DCT is going to diversify research. I have not seen one paper. I have not seen one study. I have not heard one person discuss increasing diversity in clinical trials based on decentralization. Yeah, it's just not there yet.
Well, and again, I think that's sort of a small example of the issue and why I wanted to bring people together for this conversation, because there's so much being promised right now. There's so much being, sort of sold, so to speak. And, where does the rubber really meet the road rather than, the sort of marketing?
I think it's with the PI and the research team and the site. And until we learn how to make the research team front and center, I don't see how this is going to work.
Yep, I could not agree more. And again, I think that's the hope. We continue to see that sort of alignment between all the interested parties. Anything else before we wrap up?
I just am so excited to talk about DCT because it's really a passion of mine at this point in my career. And no, I'm really excited to see what the future holds. I would love to. I'm going to listen to the other folks on here. I'm anxious to see what they have to say. I'm anxious to hear the feedback you might get from my talk. And boy, if anyone wants to reach out to me for collaborative efforts or, to take the discussion further, I'm up for it. And Brad, this has just been amazing. And I want to thank you so much for inviting me and having me participate today.
No, absolutely. We'll put your contact information in our show notes so people can reach out to you. And I'm sure this is just one of many conversations to come. So thank you so much for coming on, Joy.
Thank you so much, Brad.
All right, Dr. Viviënne van de Wal, thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. My pleasure.
Yeah, so before we dive down into more talk about DCT, tell us a little bit about sort of your background or your setup where you are doing research.
Sure. Yeah, so I'm a physician by training. I did most of my training in the Netherlands, and that's where I'm located now as well, in the south near Maastricht. I did part of my training also in Oxford. And I got a PhD in pediatrics. 20-something years ago, I participated in a clinical trial, and I found it very fascinating. And they were looking for a physician, so I applied to be there. And eventually I took over the site, and now I run an independent research site. Yeah,
so I'd say you're kind of a rare breed. I don't know that we see a lot of the research site ownership really driven by the physician as much, at least not in my experience. So I love that. I think that probably provides a pretty unique perspective because for better or worse, I feel like a lot of physicians are kind of disconnected from what actually happens in a clinical trial because the coordinators kind of do so much, I don't want to say covering up, but they do so much of the sort of lower level work for the PIs in my experience. So the fact that you've got a little more ownership or accountability is, I think, provides an interesting perspective probably.
I can agree. And the fact actually is that a lot of companies actually want me as a consultant because I run the trial. I also am the PI of a trial. I participated in a trial. So even now during the COVID pandemic, there were some trials that they were looking also for healthcare professionals that were at risk of contracting COVID to be involved in clinical trials. And I know quite a lot of people that are involved in clinical trials actually participated now for the first time in the clinical trials themselves. But I think, it is true. When you run a site as a physician, it's a totally different concept than when you are a physician participating in a clinical trial. And there's nothing wrong with that, for sure. But it's different for sure. Yeah.
Well, I think especially relevant to the topic today. I mean, I hear physicians weighing in on decentralized trials, and I can't help but get the feeling that a lot of these physicians don't really know what happens in a clinical trial from sort of the site perspective. There's a little bit of disconnect between what I hear and what I know happens at a site. So I guess just to sort of lay the groundwork here, what are you seeing in terms of increased decentralized trial methods? Is that something that you're experiencing happening more with the trials that are going on today?
Oh, yes, definitely. And also with the feasibilities that are coming in, more and more are looking at perhaps not a totally virtual or decentralized trials, but a hybrid model. And to come back to your comment that physicians don't really know what's happening, again, because of the coordinators doing all the work. So they go like, oh, yeah, it's a fine trial. I like the indication. Yes, I do have patients. And then some coordinators, they are faced with a trial saying like, why? What were you thinking? And even now, when decentralized trials setups are not, your day-to-day practice, I think it's even more challenging for somebody that's not involved on the day-to-day business to make that judgment whether this is something that you as a site can do. And of course, the whole pandemic was a pressure cooking, and going forward with the decentralized trials in general. We had to do it. We had to be ahead of the curve. We had to see the patients. We had to continue their follow-ups as good as we could. So we were kind of making things up. And I know a lot of sites, we collaborated, like, how are you dealing with this and how are you dealing with that? Because a lot of sponsors just were so slow in making those decisions. And I do appreciate it because they had to make a decision which was going to be implemented globally, or they had to take care and look at what was happening in the different countries. What was the FDA saying? What was EMA saying? What was happening in Asia Pac? So whenever they would make a statement, they had to make sure it was actually covering all the areas. But we had a patient coming in that day, and we had to decide what to do with it. And one of the things I learned from somebody I know who's working in aviation, whenever there's a crisis in a plane, they have three things: communicate, navigate, and aviate. And basically, that's what we did in the beginning, just exactly. We were doing our thing, we were communicating what we were doing, and we were making sure that, we were staying safe, at least for the patient's sake. So now when we're moving forward, and it's going to be more something that's going to be implemented, the trials are being set up as being a decentralized trials, not like, oh, we're just, kneading it into something that's going to be decentralized. I still sometimes I'm surprised that I do get feasibilities coming in these days where they're talking about phone visits. And I go like, can't we just go forward and do these like video calls? Because, it's much more interactive. I can, when they have a rash, they can show it to me. I can see how they are responding instead of a phone call. So I'm kind of surprised that these things are still, telephone visits. And other trials, they're really moving fast forward, saying like, okay, this is a 10-year trial. We just want one site in this country covering everything. And are you interested in doing that? But I keep telling everybody, we're still in the learning curve, even from a budget point of view. How much is this going to cost us? How much work is going to be involved? How are we going to monitor? Can we do remote data verification, which is actually in the Netherlands, where I'm located, not allowed yet. We're looking at a way to do it, but for now, it's not allowed. It will change, I assume, this year or next year. But there's a lot more work involved, and then also the monitoring itself, the ad hoc phone calls we get, the multiple emails that we get. But I can't get angry with it because I know it's where we're going and it's the way to move forward. But we have to accept the fact that we're in a learning curve and we just have to continue communicate. And I'm glad that some sponsors have actually asked me to go on board in the working group. Like, we want to have something more on decentralized trials and we want to have a signed voice in there. Like, what are the issues? And one of the main issues that we've, as a site, always been dealing with, but I've seen increased now with moving into decentralized trials, is the number of vendors and portals we have to work with. And it's not making our life easier. There's multiple trainings. You get these emails and you have no clue for which trial this vendor is contacting you. If you don't reset your password within 24 hours, you have to go back. There's the other day, and I think I even posted it on LinkedIn. I got an email from one vendor. I went to the website, which was actually the address of another vendor. When I logged in, I had to change my password, where I got an email from another vendor. And then when I finally got in, it stated, can you please, how do you say that, approve, all the rules and regulations, which again was another vendor. And then when I finally got in, there wasn't any protocol. So help us.
Yeah, and I think that's it seems maybe, not as big of a deal to some as you would think, but you're right. I mean, just the amount of portals and vendors we already deal with is confusing. I still see patients myself for studies, and I was randomizing a patient not too long ago, and I could not figure out the correct order in which I had to get this patient registered, to get a subject number, to go enter enough data so that they could be randomized, so that I could give them an e-diary. And so, that alone is certainly some low-hanging fruit. I feel like that, can be fixed up. But you're right. If you go look at, DTRA, which is like the big alliance of decentralized trial vendors. I mean, at this point, there's got to be hundreds of companies all in this space kind of fighting for whatever their particular, niche is. But I think that's kind of concerning and overwhelming for sites to see, because you're right. What does this mean? Does this mean we're going to be dealing with another 2-3 vendors with each trial that we work with? I mean, is this in some ways, I'm with you, and I have to remind myself, this is just the point that we're at right now. Yeah. Maybe you just calm down a little bit, let these things play out. But in the meantime, it's affecting sites right now too, because we're sort of having to be the the irony is, I feel like we're sort of the like playground or experiment ground where it happens. Yeah. But
the learning
oftentimes
curve.
Exactly, but we don't really oftentimes get the front end input. And I do think, as you say, you're being approached. I'm seeing more vendors reach out and talk to site level coordinators or physicians, whatever the case may be. So I guess I'm really hopeful for the future, because I'm, again, to echo your sentiment, I mean, this is the way things are going. Yeah. Like it or not, you can kick and fight and scream, but we're going to move towards these things. And ultimately, I do think it'll be better for patients and sites once we get it sort of figured out. But I think it's there's so much uncertainty that can be kind of demoralizing at the site level at times, because coordinators are already so busy. There's already so much confusion dealing with all of these different technology vendors or lab vendors or IVRS, whatever the case may be. So it can be just a big load on the site. And then if you throw in something else you pointed out is this going to take away budgets or monies from the site by, if I'm not seeing a patient in clinic, if we're doing it on the phone, are you going to get compensated less as a site? How is this going to start to hurt the bottom line for sites as well? I mean, do you feel like that's a legitimate concern sites may have?
Yeah, and I know from other sites as well that we sometimes find it challenging how to set up a budget, how much time is involved. So one of the things we had developed already a couple of years ago was a budget questionnaire that I would, send to the sponsor or the CRO. How many vendors are you working with? How many hours of trainings do we have to attend? We always know a 1 hour training is never a 1 hour training. By the time you've logged in, you already lost 30 minutes and then you have to print out and upload your certificate somewhere else. So basically it's about at least 50, if not 100% double at the time. So sometimes I incorporate all that work into my startup budget, and sponsors are declining those. And then I literally send them the Excel sheet based on the information that they provided me with. Like, this is what you're asking me to do. And don't tell me it's part of doing the business. It's part of doing the business with you, because I have to do it for you, not for somebody else.
Right.
Fortunately, more and more vendors have set up a system that I can log in and show them I have a certificate. And most of the trainings are not protocol specific, like for an EDC or IVRS systems or whatever. You can tell how long I've been in the business because I still call it an IVRS business. We still say we're making a randomization call at our site. So we feel like we're dinosaurs sometimes. But the other thing with the budget is, and this was happening actually over the Christmas period that I got, which was going to be a 10-year follow-up, which was going to be totally virtual. And so there were a couple of sites in the Netherlands that participated, and they asked me to do the follow-up for all the sites. They say, this is just a check every 6 months and the rest is going through e-diaries. Would you be interested in doing that? And of course I was interested. This is the kind of challenges you're looking for as a dedicated research site. But I got a budget and they didn't incorporate the fact that over the course of 10 years, salaries increase, your rent increase, things like that increase. So it was a fixed fee for 10 years. And I had to explain to this person, like, I think we should, at least every 2 to 3 years, have an increase in those visits. And they still don't know how to incorporate that. They just want to have a fixed budget for 10 years and not have that change every 3 years. And of course, this was also happening when we're not doing hybrid trials. But I do think now with this kind of setup, more people are looking at long-term follow-ups in an easy way. We can do some follow-up for a longer period. One of the things that puzzles me, and I really don't know, people saying like, when we're going into these decentralized trials, we can access more patients. And that's, it's often an argument. And again, going back at the pandemic, I was surprised how many households did not have internet access when children were educated at home because they had to stay at home during the quarantine. So there were companies and government were handing out laptops, were sending up Wi-Fi at homes and things like that. So sometimes I think perhaps we're actually accessing another patient group when we're going decentralized. And there might be a group that is now very much willing to come into the clinic that just is not that savvy in all these electronics for whatever reason, but are going to be deprived. So I hear more and more that it's going to be a hybrid model where we can see, how is this going to work, and patients can have the choice whether to be doing this at home or coming into the clinic, because literally some patients really want to come to the clinic and being pampered and, seeing somebody, or having the choice, like, okay, if it's not necessarily, that's fine. We can do it, virtually. But once in a while, I really like you to have a look at me. For me, I think that's even more challenging to budget.
Well, yeah, you end up with, not infinite, but certainly a lot more mixed models that sort of start to spring up. And like you said, at this point, at least in the US, inflation has gone up crazily over the last year. So that alone, you're going to be losing 6-10% of your budgets every year if you set a fixed fee. That's something I haven't really considered before. So that's actually very interesting. But yeah, like you said, I in my experience, so much of enrollment and retention is trust and relationship building with patients that become research subjects. And I fear that we lose that connection, then you're going to lose the quality of subject in the research trials. And look, I can't tell you how often me or my staff, we take phone calls about malfunctioning e-diaries or whatever the case may be. It's going to, I just feel like additional amount of work that's going to come from the site is kind of underestimated right now, very likely. And it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out. But even beyond that, even now, sponsors are good at burying things, invoiceables and budgets that make it hard for sites to track and sort of keep up with. So, if you're now running a study 6 different ways and mix and match, some of these things, is it going to just create yet another burden on even tracking that from the site level?
Yeah. And, the more systems you're using, the more risk of errors I'm afraid of can happen. But again, when we were moving from paper CRFs into electronic CRFs, we had this transition as well that, it was a bit of reluctance. It was slow. There was a time where I had a laptop for each and every trial I was running. So we were having 10 laptops at a site. So we've come far from that, and it's much more accessible. And, basically you can do 50% of your trial drinking a cocktail, sitting in the sun on whatever beach you are at, which I think is appealing as well for sometimes. On the other hand, we had issues where people were working from home, but person A didn't know about person B, thinking, oh, it's in the system, it stayed. And we were actually not receiving the trial drug for 10 days. And, I was sitting there with my patients, and you can't get a hold of, and even people from a help desk working from home, and then those systems weren't working. And the only thing you could do was, leave a message. But if I call a help desk, it's because I have an emergency issue most of the time. And there's an infamous slide I once used saying, like, we love help desks that help. And that's actually still challenging. So, yeah, again, it is the way to move forward, but I think it's so crucial to communicate. For us as a site to say, okay, this is what we're running into. Or when you, as a sponsor, you want to move forward, have us at the table, at the drawing table, making sure that we're on the same page, we understand each other, we have the same expectations, and listen to us and the lessons learned. And there are so many lessons learned already from the last 2 years that we can easily take on board with the next steps that we have. And as you said, all these vendors that were recently at this convention, if they would communicate to each other and have a single log on for us as a site, and then going to the different systems, that would at least, be so much more helpful.
Yeah, that alone would, I think, make a world of difference. Somebody just make a single sign on, and you don't have to log into 6 systems or try to figure out which system you need to be in at which time. So yeah. I love that.
No, I like to be challenged. And, I've gone from paper to the electronic CRFs to, the old electronics. And I'm actually quite looking forward to where this is going to. Is this going to be where I'm literally sitting at a desk with a big dashboard, and that's how I'm running a trial like a pilot? I'm not sure, but I'm looking forward to, the direction where we're going at.
Yeah, I think, there's no question it's an exciting time. There's, regardless of the bumps and bruises we may get along the way, I think we're headed towards something that's going to hopefully dramatically change how clinical trials are done, so that we can do our jobs better and that more patients can be helped along the way. So yeah, I think we're all rooting for the same end goal. I think it's just a matter of how do we get there with the least turbulence, so to speak. So okay, I love it. Where can people find you online, Viviënne?
Where they can find me online? Well, my site is actually www.ptr.nu, not an L, but NU. And you can find me on LinkedIn, Viviënne van der Wal, and please connect. And, as I keep saying, if you want to pick my brain, as long as you don't hurt me, you're welcome to pick my brain as much as you want.
All right. Thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome.
All right, guys. As always, thanks so much for listening. You can check out our show notes, episode transcripts, and contact info for our guests at notefilepodcast.com. It's really my hope to keep the conversation open about decentralized clinical trials. So if you're interested in coming on and sharing your voice, please reach out to me at brad@notefilepodcast.com. Thanks again.